Today we're going to be talking about why read old books. We're largely going to be looking at an article written by C.S. Lewis that was put as an introduction to On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius. On the Incarnation is a mighty fine work. It's a great classic of Christian theology written by a great Christian saint, St. Athanasius, who was a figure who was at the Council of Nicaea and defended the Trinitarian faith largely and especially the divinity of Christ. And if you've read the Nicene Creed, you'll know his work, and, you'll know what I'm talking about a little bit. But this work here is where he fleshes out the mystery of the Incarnation. If you know the Incarnation was is a doctrine that is held by all Orthodox Christians, lowercase o, because I'm a Protestant. I'm not saying Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy here, but just all Orthodox Christians hold to the Incarnation, which is the mystery of how God became man, right? While not ceasing or throwing away his divinity, but taking on the fullness of humanity, while remaining fully and truly God, while also being fully and truly human. Not divided or blended together, fully both at the same time. God fully took on the limitations of humanity, while retaining his infiniteness as God. How all that mystery works is, what this book talks about. And it's one of the most beautiful parts of Christian theology. And is central to salvation. Alright, we're not going to go too far into that, although it's a very interesting topic, and, I might talk about that later. Not on this video. So, the preface by C.S. Lewis. I think it was written sometime in the 1940s. So let me get into it. There's a strange idea abroad in every subject that the ancient book should be read only by the professionals, and that the amateur should content himself with modern books. Thus I have found, as a tutor in English literature, that if the average student wants to find out something about Platonism, the very last thing he thinks of doing is taking a translation of Plato off the library shelf and reading the Symposium. He would rather read some dreary modern book, 10 times as long, about isms and influences, and only once in 10 times as long, only talking about isms, only once in about 12 pages, telling him what Plato actually said. The error is rather amiable one, for it springs from humility. The student is half afraid to meet one of the great philosophers face to face. He feels himself inadequate and thinks he will not understand him. But if he only knew the great man just because of his greatness is much more intelligible than his modern commentator. The simplest student will be able to understand, if not all, yet a very great deal of what Plato said. But hardly anyone can understand some of the modern books on Platonism. It has always therefore been one of my main endeavors as a teacher to persuade the young that first-hand knowledge is not only more worth acquiring than second-hand knowledge, but it is usually much easier and much more delightful to acquire. So, everything Lewis there has said, I completely agree with. I've been reading the classics for years and years. Originally, I started reading them unaware. I would just read old books, naturally. But eventually, I found out what the classics were, and I actually moved into the study of the great books as a hobby. And one thing I'll say is that, I don't claim to be overly intelligent. I'm not the smartest guy you'll ever meet. I'm naturally probably below average in intelligence. But I'm still able to understand these great works, and it's helped me grow from where I was as someone who is probably less intelligent than average to somebody who has his fair share of intelligence. My intelligence is higher because of it. So I think that if, the average person who probably has a baseline intelligence that is much higher than mine, if they went and read these books, it would boost their intelligence even further than mine. And I don't claim to be overly smart because I read books, but, there is something that helps you grow and helps you understand the universe. And if I can do it, pretty much anyone can do it. That's the point that I'm trying to get at here. This mistaken preference for the modern books and the shyness of the old ones is no more rampant than in theology. Wherever you can find a little study circle of Christian laity, you can almost be certain that they are not studying St. Luke or St. Paul or St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or Hooker or Butler, but M. Boyarve or M. Martin or N. Nubar or Miss Sayers or even myself. Most of those figures I don't know. I'll be honest, I only know Lewis. That's the only figure out of that list that I know. Probably because they didn't stand the test of time. I think Lewis has stood the test of time. Maybe some of those other figures have, and I just haven't heard of them. But really, reading the classics is great because they've stood the test of time. You know that they're worth reading because people to this day are still reading these books, even though they might be 100, 200, 300, 400, 1,000, 2,000, even close up to, 2,700 years old. That's a classic book. If you're still reading a book that's been around for 2,000, 2,300 years, that's going to be a classic. That's going to be a great book. No doubt about it. Now, this seems to me topsy-turvy. Naturally, since I myself am a writer, I do not wish the ordinary reader to read no modern books, but if he must read only new or only the old, I would advise him to read the old. And I would give him this advice precisely because he is an amateur, and therefore much less protected than the expert against the dangers of an exclusively contemporary diet. A new book is still on its trial, and the amateur is not in a position to judge it. It has to be tested against the great body of Christian thought down through the ages, and all its hidden implications, often unsuspected by the author himself, have to be brought to light. Often, it can be fully understood without the knowledge of a good many other modern books. One thing I'll say here is that he's specifically talking about Christian theology because this is the book on Christian theology, but this is true for pretty much any subject you'll read. I've read very diversely, very widely in the classics, and not because I'm overly smart. I'm not trying to claim to be overly smart, but I've been able to gain a great deal from a lot of different figures, such as Plato, Aristotle, all the Greek philosophers, from the Romans, from, the Renaissance figures, from all these different time periods, from figures from the Reformation, post-Reformation, all these different time periods, I have been able to understand, and in all different subjects, whether it's history, whether I'm reading something like, Herodotus' history, or Plutarch's Lives, or whatever I'm reading, I've been able to gain a great deal, even in politics and all these different subjects. When you read these classic works, you're able to gain and learn a great deal. I'm not sure if I'll light up the pipe or not today. So if you're like, why is he pointing with the pipe? I'm just using it to read right now. I might light it up later. We'll see. Here we are. Often it cannot be fully understood, I'm rereading this part, without a knowledge of a good many other modern books. If you join at 11 o'clock a conversation which begins at 8, you will often not see the real bearings of what is said. Remarks which seem to you very ordinary will produce laughter or irritation, and you will not see why. The reason, of course, being that the earlier stages of the conversation have given them a special point. In the same way, sentences in a modern book, which look quite ordinary, may be directed at some other book. In this way, you may be led to accept what you would have indignantly rejected if you knew its real significance. The only safety is to have a standard of plain central Christianity, mere Christianity. We'll pause there really quick. So that point about the conversation is really interesting. If you've read the Great Books of the Western World book set, a book set that I'll probably review at some point, is a book set that I've been going over and going through. And if you've read the Great Books of the Western World, the original, I believe it's 1952, 1954 when it was published, I can't remember exactly, but there's an introductory book called The Great Conversation, where it goes over how the Great Books of the Western World are really a great conversation. One book, so let's say Plato writes something, and when Plato writes something, he's been influenced by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and some of the works that came before him. And then later figures like St. Augustine are going to be influenced by Plato, who is influenced by the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I believe Augustine probably would have also read the Iliad and the Odyssey. I don't see why he wouldn't have. And, then obviously somebody like Thomas Aquinas, who is going to come later, is going to have a lot of influence brought from all those figures who came before, Plato, Aristotle, and obviously Aristotle was taught by Plato directly. So you have all these different converging points where the Western world is, and the great books of the Western world, the great conversation is a conversation. Every book that's written enters into it, and the great books survive. And then later commentators will write, they will be influenced by these books, they will challenge what those books said, and then you're entering into this almost like cosmic human debate that's been going on for thousands of years. And it's not just a debate, it's like agreement, debate, disagreement. It's a conversation. It flows. People enjoy it. It brings laughter. It brings anger. It brings all the different emotions. And it's all brought into this deep conversation that is brought from one author to another. And obviously somebody like a Benjamin Franklin or a Thomas Jefferson is going to have read a great number of figures that came before them. They're going to understand all these different historical figures, and this was really the point of classical education at one point, is to enter people into this great kind of conversation. And this analogy is a pretty fitting one to the reading of the great books. But here I am. The only safety is to have a standard in place, in plain central Christianity, mere Christianity as Baxter called it, which, if you've read that book by C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Mere Christianity. I would recommend it if you are a Christian and you want, an introduction to Christian theology, or if you're not a Christian and you want something where you can kind of start to understand what is the Christian worldview broadly. I would look at C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I'd also look at the Bible, obviously. I'm not saying don't read the Bible, just read what Lewis wrote. But I would say Lewis does a great job at explaining the philosophical side of Christianity in Mere Christianity in a way that the average lay Christian should have no problem having a pretty decent understanding of. And, and originally when he wrote that, or it was originally a radio broadcast, but then he wrote it into a book, it was designed for your common man, for the average worker. It wasn't designed for, stuffed up theologians. C.S. Lewis is taking those ideas that the theologians of the past, the deep thinkers such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and all these figures have taught, but he's making it he's writing it in a way that's more simple and easy to understand, which puts the conversation of the moment in its proper perspective. Such a standard can be acquired only from the old books. It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones. Every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths, and especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books. All contemporary writers share, to some extent, the contemporary outlook, even those like myself, who seem to oppose it. Nothing strikes me more than when I read the conversations of a past age than the fact that both sides were usually assuming without question a good deal, which we should now absolutely deny. They thought that they were as completely opposite as two sides could be, but in fact they were all the time secretly united with each other against earlier and later ages, by a great mass of common assumptions. We may be sure that the characteristic blindness of the 20th century, the blindness about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought that, lies where we would have never suspected it, and concerns something about which there is undoubtedly agreement between Hitler and President Roosevelt, or between Mr. H.G. Wells and Karl Barth. None of us can fully escape the blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. I mean, that's just a fantastic point. One of the greatest values in reading old books isn't because old books are magical. It's because we have a certain outlook. We have a certain way of looking at the universe, a way of looking at life that we can't really get around because we live in the age we do. It's the air we breathe. We've been taught this since we were a child. And to get around something like that, it's just fundamental to our assumptions. It is a dogma that is deeply embedded in us. And there's nothing we can really do to shake that assumption unless, we're radically challenged philosophically and everything gets torn out of balance. But generally, we're just blind to these things. But when you read old books, you'll find that people had perspectives very, very different from how we view things. And you'll start to learn that our perspective, as good as it may be in some ways, isn't going to be the final perspective. We are not the final truth. And the people before us weren't the final truth. Of course, there is an absolute truth. I'm not claiming that there isn't. I'm a Christian. All Christians will generally believe that there is an absolute truth. They ought to, at least, because, the absolute truth to a Christian is the Lord Jesus Christ. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me. That is the Christian perspective on what truth is. Truth is fundamentally inherent to the man Jesus Christ. We can know truth as a person, and that person came to the earth, right? But we'll go a little bit beyond that now. But yeah, that would be the point that I go into. I'm going to start reading again. Where they are true. Hold on, I'll probably start back a little bit so it makes sense again. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it, and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truth, which we half know already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries flowing through our minds, and this can only be done by reading old books. Not, of course, that there's any magic about the past. People were no cleverer than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing, and their own errors, being now open and palatable, will not endanger us. Two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, the books of the future will be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately we cannot get to them. I myself was first led into reading the Christian classics almost by accident, as a result of my English studies. Some such as Hooker, Herbert, Tenter, Sayre, and Bunyan, I read because they are themselves great English writers. Others, such as Boethius, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Dante, because they were influences. George MacDonald I had found for myself at the age of 16, and never wavered in my allegiance, though I tried for a long time to ignore his Christianity. They are, you will know, a mixed bag, representative of many churches, climates, and ages. And that brings me to yet another reason to read them. The division of Christendom are undeniable, and are by some of these writers most fiercely expressed. But if any man is tempted to think, as one might be tempted who reads only contemporaries, that Christianity is a word for so many meanings, that it means nothing at all, he can learn beyond a doubt by stepping out of his own century that this is not so. Measured against the ages, mere Christianity turns out to be no inspid. I'm not sure what this word is. I'll be frank when I don't know a word. I believe INSPID, inspid, interdenominational transparency, but something positive, self-consists and inexhaustible. I know it indeed to my cost. In those days when I still hated Christianity, I learned to recognize, like some all too familiar smell, that almost unwavering something which met me. Now a Puritan Bunyan, now an Anglican Hooker, now a Thomas Dante. It was there, honored and floraled. In Francisco de Sales, it was there, grave and homely. In Spencer and Walton, it was there, grim but manful. In Pascal and Johnson, there again, with a mild frigidity, frightening, where is this? I'm gonna spell it again for you. Prasidistal, Paradisial, of the 18th century. One was not safe. Law and Butler were two lions in the past, supposed Supposed paganism of the Elizabethans could not keep it out. It lay in wait where a man might have supposed he was safe. Of course, varied and yet, after all, so unmistakable, the same, recognizable, not to be evaded, the odor which is death to us until we allow it to become life. An air that kills from yon far country bows. I think that's an interesting point too. And this is going to be a little bit on the side of Christian theology instead of, so I'm going to get into Christian theology here a little bit. But there's a handful of theories on how the church works. But I think that this argument here is the fundamental argument for branch theory. Branch theory is the view that there is one true church, but it is divided amongst a handful of denominations. That there are there are debates, there are disputes, and it's not ideal. Generally the view would be that it's not ideal, but that the church does exist in multiple denominations. And the main argument for that would be, look at the fruits of all the different denominations. You look at the Catholics or the Protestants or the Orthodox. You look at within Protestant denominations, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, and you see the fruits of the Spirit. You see the world fighting against those different groups. You see all these different, Christian signs, these evidence. Christ said, when you see a tree, you'll know a fruit by its tree. You'll know a tree by its fruits. You'll know if he's good or not by the fruits that he bears. Does he bear good fruits or bad fruits? And when you look at all the different denominations, you'll see that very often they all bear Christian fruits. And that's really one of the best arguments for branch theory. We are all rightly and distressed and ashamed also by the divisions of Christendom, but those who have always lived within the Christian fold may be too easily despaired by them. They are bad, but such people do not know what it looks like from without. Seen from there, what is left intact despite all the division still appears as it truly is, an immensely formidable unity. I know, for I saw it, and well our enemies know it. That unity any of us can find by going out of his own age. It is not enough, but it is more than you had thought till then. Once you are well soaked in it, if you then venture out to speak, you will have an amusing experience. You will be thought a papist when you are actually reproducing Bunyan, and a pantheist when you are quoting Aquinas, and so forth. That is actually kind of interesting. So, one of those things that you'll find kind of interesting when you read, old theology, very often people think you're a papist when you quote ideas from Calvin. When you start talking ideas from Calvin, they'll be like, that sounds like papist nonsense. And then you're like, but hold on, that's what John Calvin believed. That's what Martin Luther believed. That's what the early Protestants believed. And they'll be like, that sounds Catholic. But there is that common instinct, especially in the evangelical world, to look at you, and if you quote older Christian theology, because unfortunately, one of the biggest faults of Protestants, and I'm willing to admit it as a Protestant, is that we do, not always, but very often, we do horrible at church history. We do horrible church history, especially in the modern day. You read the great Protestant theologians, and most of them are deeply involved in church history. They understand church history in a way that is very deep, and honestly, in my opinion, as a Protestant, it's the most honest to church history. Protestants can approach it in a way where they don't have to necessarily sugarcoat and make everything simple. Whereas when you look at a lot of Eastern Orthodox and a lot of Catholics, they have a problem dealing with the complexities of church history. Catholics can do it a little bit easier because Catholics have the ability to uphold what might be called development of doctrine. Protestants can also believe that if they want to. But development of doctrine can make this problem a little bit simpler. But very often for a lot of Orthodox and very traditional Catholics who are strongly opposed to saying that there's any development of doctrine, there's difficulty because you have to say, well, where does something, and I'm not here to attack Catholics either, but where does a doctrine such as, let's say purgatory, or not even just purgatory. Purgatory is less good of an example, but I would just say, views such as the treasury of merit and all. There's a lot of different views that can be brought up, and specifically explaining the Eucharist as transubstantiation. Of course, there's a view of it being real presence in the early church, but transubstantiation specifically, all these kind of views where the theology is much deeper, it's much further along, and right or wrong, it is different from what the early Christians believe. There's a lot more to it than what the early Christians believe, and that's fine to a Catholic who holds to something like development of doctrine, because you can say, well, the church is a living organism, and it's going to grow, and it's going to change over time. Protestants will say, well, I don't really find where the church changes to be an essential. And I think a great example would be the papacy as it's viewed today. I think that's probably the best example and probably the most fundamental example, is that, the papacy as it exists in the modern day is probably, there's scant evidence that it's the exact way that the early Christians viewed it. Now, there may or may not have been a primacy of Peter. It seems that there was a primacy of Peter at the apostle himself, amongst the other church, the other apostles, but just because there was a primacy of Peter amongst the other apostles in the church, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be carried forward in the same way. Now, of course, many early church fathers are going to say, look to the church in Rome. Ignatius of Antioch, I believe. Is it Ignatius of Antioch? He's going to say, look at Rome, because that's where Peter and Paul were martyred. That's the seat of Peter and Paul. That's where they died. So when you want to know what Christian orthodoxy is, look at Rome, and so on. So yes, there is a very high view of Rome, and you can understand how this view would slowly develop from... I'm getting a little off the rails. I'll get back to my subject in a minute. But you can see how this idea would start to develop. You have these slight primacies of, Rome that's been upheld in the early church, and how eventually you would get to a point where the Bishop of Rome becomes the infallible vicar of Christ, who bears the sword of both heaven and earth. And, you get all these eventual points that Protestants say, well, this seems to have gone a little bit far. Very often we'll be able to admit, yes, there was a certain degree of honor and respect that belonged to Rome that didn't belong to the other churches. But over time, because Rome had this honor, it slowly started to take power for itself until it grew tyrannical. And that would generally be a wider Protestant view that upholds church history. Of course, there's the Restorationists, which I'm not a Restorationist, and I strongly oppose Restorationism. I just struggle with the concept that Christianity could, just die out, and then every Christian before that would go to hell until Martin Luther came and discovered the gospel again. I don't believe that that's what happened. I struggle with that, and I think that that's a view that a lot of, unfortunately, Protestants have, and that's because they're just historically ignorant. They haven't read the Church Fathers. They don't understand the Church Fathers. But I also do accept, personally, I believe that there is a certain degree of development of doctrine. I just don't think it exists in the same way that Catholics tend to see it. And that would be a different video that's probably worth making at a different time, with more research, more, notes and stuff like that, instead of just shooting off the hip like I am now. All right, where the heck am I now? We're talking about being called a papist. Or quoting Aquinas, so forth. For you have now got on to the great level. Hold on, okay. All right, Bunyan, when you're quoting Bunyan, and when you're quoting Aquinas and so forth. Okay. For you have now got on to the great level of Voduction, I believe that's right, which crosses all the ages, and which looks so high from the valley, so low from the mountains, so narrow compared with the swamps, and so broad compared with the sheep tracks. The present book is something of an experiment. The translation is intended for the world at large, not only for theological students. If it succeeds, other translations, of which great Christian books will presumably follow. In one sense, of course, it is not the first in the field of translations. The translations of the Theologica Germanica, the Imitation, the Scale of Perfection, and the Revelations of Lady Julian of Norwich are already on the market, and are very valuable, though some of them are not very scholarly. But it will be noted that these are all books of devotion, rather than of doctrine. This is where it gets into some of my favorite parts. Now, the layman or the amateur needs to be instructed as well as exhorted. In this age, his need for knowledge is particularly pressing, nor would I admit any sharp division between the two kinds of books. For my own part, I tend to find that doctrinal books are more helpful in devotion than the devotional books, and I rather suspect the same experience may await others. I believe that many who find nothing happens when they sit down or kneel down to a book of devotion would find that their hearts sing unbidden while they are working their way through a tough bit of theology with a pipe in their teeth and a pencil in their hand. I mean, that's just one of my favorite lines. This is, honestly, I probably smoke a pipe because of Lewis. I don't smoke a lot. I smoke probably once a week. And then I'll smoke about once a week, about 3 weeks in a row, and then I'll take about 3 weeks off. That's usually my smoking routine. Sometimes it'll be a cigar, sometimes it'll be a pipe. But I almost certainly smoke a pipe because I like Lewis so much. And that line just, it's so true. It's so true, right? If you've never studied theology and you're a Christian, especially if you're a man, I think one of those big problems that men have with Christianity is that the modern church is feminized. It's true, it's ruled by women, unfortunately, and we've just made the church overly soft in a lot of ways, especially the Protestant church. We need to get strong again in the Protestant church. One of those things that is great about Protestantism and about any denomination, and something that would really bring men back into the faith, is learning with their head. Men have a hard time getting into their emotions and feelings. And you'll walk into this evangelical worship and everyone will be singing and they'll be dancing and they'll be all like, there'll be somebody crying over here and you're like, what is going on? Especially if you're not a Christian. You're like, you don't have any spiritual experience with God and you're like, this is just feels weird. I don't know what to do with this. It just feels overly emotional. Like, what is going on? And honestly, I feel the same way a lot of times. But one of those things that's helped me to actually start to understand that is starting with my head. I'm a man. I'm going to learn things with my head before my heart, it reaches my heart. Women might be able to just jump in and learn stuff with their heart and then everything's honky-dory. But for us men, at least for a lot of us men, we need to figure it out with our head. And when you read deep theology, when you read the Bible, when you read all these great works, when you read all these great books, that's when it reaches your heart. It goes from your head to your heart. And that's the importance of reading a lot of these great theology and just reading great books in general. You want to love Western culture? You want to love Western history? Read the books of Western history. Bring it into your head, and then it will go to your heart. But yeah, and I just love that line. That's one of my favorite lines. And, I do like devotional books sometimes. But for me, what brings my heart to prayer, which brings me to God, is the study of the mysteries. The studies of the mysteries of Scripture, of the mysteries of, theology, of different ideas, of the understanding of God, and then eventually realizing how much beyond you it is, and then crying out to God for mercy, crying out to God for understanding. That is when my heart leaps. That is when my heart is devoted to God, is in deep study. This is a good translation of a very good book. St. Athanasius has suffered in popular esteem from a certain sentence in the Athanasian Creed, which I will not labor the point that work is not exactly a creed, and that it was not by St. Athanasius, for I think it is a very fine piece of writing. The words which faith, except every one do keep whole and undefiled, without doubt, he shall perish everlastingly, which, to the Athanasian Creed, so true, so true. And this offense, they are commonly misunderstood. The operative word is keep, not acquire, or even believe, but keep. Now, I think at this point, I understand where he's going, and I understand the time period that he's in, but I think it's a little bit soft. I think that we should be strong enough to say, unless you keep and hold this faith, or even if you don't believe this faith, we should presume that you're probably not going to be saved. Now, that's unfortunate. Now, it is true, I believe that there is people who are going to be saved who don't know the gospel. There may be people who will be saved, at least, who don't know the gospel. And there's people who may be saved in Old Testament time periods who never knew or never had the ability to understand who Christ was. I like to believe that, but I don't like to presume it. I don't think it's safe or wise to presume it. And I think that this point about that Lewis is making here, I think he's a little bit soft. I understand why, because there's this very soft theological trend that was starting to come into vogue in this time period in Protestantism. And Lewis has a perspective which, if you read Mere Christianity, I think can be helpful. Because I do agree with him that it may be possible for people outside of understanding Christianity to be saved, but I think the way he states that, I think, can be a little bit misleading and can lead some people to have the wrong idea and to believe that in a sort of universalism where most people are saved. Where, and that's why you need to read old books. That's why you read Lewis. Yeah, I agree. I love Lewis. Read Lewis. Also read Jonathan Edwards. Read Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And you're going to get the perspective of how much me, you, and everyone else deserves hell, according to the Christian scriptures. How much we truly deserve to go, and, we deserve the sin that we have. We completely deserve everything we have coming to us. And it's only by the grace of God, only by his power, but only by his sovereign hand that any of us are saved at all. That is, also important to have. But, that sinners in the hands of an angry God can be too harsh sometimes. And that's why you need the balance. You need the strengths of Jonathan Edwards, the softness of some figures like Lewis on these perspectives. And that's why it's important to read old books. The author is, in fact, not talking about unbelievers, but about desires, not about those who have never heard of Christ, nor even those who have misunderstood and refused to accept him, but as those having really understood and really believed, and then allowed themselves under the sway of sloth, or of fashion, or of any other invented confusion, to be drawn away into the sub-Christian modes of thought. Now, his commentary here, though, is true. That is true. That is what the Athanasian Creed is talking about. But I still think it's important to remember that this faith is essential for all people, whether they believe or not. They are a warning against the curious modern assumption that all changes of belief, however brought about, are necessarily exempt from blame. But this is not my immediate concern. I mentioned the creed, commonly called the St. Athanasius, only to get out of the reader's way what may have been a bogey, and to put the true Athanasius in his place. His epitaph in Athanasius, Contra Mundum, Athanasius against the world, we are proud that our country... Actually, let me stop on this point. So, his epitaph, as he calls it, I believe that's epitaph, I don't know if that's right, but Contra Mundum, which means Athanasius against the world. That's a powerful statement. So if you know Athanasius' story, he was kicked out of the church by the Arian bishops multiple times, had to flee out into the desert, and then continued to stand up and defend the church, even after being exiled multiple times, where he continued to write loads of great theology books, all worth the reading, defending the true Trinitarian faith. We are proud that our country has more than once stood against the world. Athanasius did the same. Now, obviously, Lewis is British, and if you know the history of Britain, at that time period, they're standing up against Germany. In his life, he was standing up against Germany again in World War I. And, before that, obviously, he's inquiring back to Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, Britain standing up against Napoleon, all these different historical events. He stood for the Trinitarian doctrine, Athanasius we're talking about here, whole and undefiled, when it looked as if all the civilized world was slipping back from Christianity into the religion of Arius, into one of those sensible, synthetic religions which are so strongly recommended today, and which then is now included among them devotees, many highly cultivated clergymen. It is his glory that he did not move with the times. It is his reward that he now remains with those times, as all times do and have moved away. When I first opened his De Incarnation, I soon discovered, by a very simple test, that I was reading a masterpiece. I knew very little Christian Greek except of the New Testament, and I had expected difficulties. To my astonishment, I found it almost as easy as Xenophon, and only a mastermind could, in the 4th century, have written so deeply on such a subject, with such classic simplicity. Every page I read confirmed its impression. His approach to the miracles is badly needed today, for it is the final answer to those who object to them as arbitrary and meaningless violations of the law of nature. Now, obviously, this is also going to be a point. Lewis wrote a book called On Miracles, which, if you do have that kind of concern, that's a great book from Lewis to read, although On the Incarnation could also, as he's stating here, argue from it in a much more ancient way. They are here shown to be rather the retelling in capsule letters of the same message, which nature writes in her own crabbed cursive hand. The very operations one would expect of him who was so full of life that when he wished to die he had to borrow death from others. The whole book, indeed, is a picture of the tree of life, a sappy golden book, full of buoyancy and confidence. We cannot, I admit, appropriate all of its confidence today. We cannot point to the high virtue of Christians living and the gay, almost mocking courage of Christian martyrdom as a proof of our doctrines, with quite the assurance that Athanasius takes as a matter of course. But whoever may be to blame for that, it is not Athanasius. The translator knows so much more Christian Greek than I, that it would be out of place for me to praise her version, but it seems to me to be in the right tradition of English translation. I do not think the reader will find here any of the sawdusty quality which is so common in modern renderings from the ancient languages. That is so much as the English reader will notice. Those who compare the version of the original will be able to estimate how much wit and talent is presupposed in such a choice. For example, such as these wise acres on the very first page. C.S. Lewis. So, that's his introduction. Obviously I read over it. I'm not a perfect reader. I don't claim to be a perfect reader. But I would recommend reading On the Incarnation. Absolutely. And I'd recommend reading this article for yourself, going over his introduction. You can also get free PDFs online, so if you don't want to spend the money, you can get a free PDF of the introduction and of On the Incarnation. You can also find, very often, free audiobooks of On the Incarnation, and you can find a free audiobook of On the Incarnation on YouTube itself. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to get through the book. You can also find a free translation of that article on YouTube. So, yeah, look into it, read it. Tell me what you think of this article if you've read it yourself. And I think I'll be heading out now. So, I hope all of you wind up having a good day. And I will see you soon.